what we're doing is we're just taking a very leisurely stroll through chapter 11. It's a chapter that's got so many different facets to it. So we're just taking a few verses at a time. I think next week actually we take a slightly bigger chunk, but this week we've just got 3 verses. Okay. So as I said, it's been a few weeks since we last visited the book of Hebrews. So I'm just going to give you a very brief synopsis of where we've been so far, just by way of reminding us and catching up. And those who haven't been with us in the past, this is just a little bit of outline of the book of Hebrews. So the book was written to a predominantly Jewish readership, and they'd been brought up in the traditions of Judaism. But they had in the recent past become believers in Yeshua as their Messiah. And they'd become part of a community of believers. And although their actual location isn't known, however, because of the intensity of the persecution of Christians at the hands of Rome, many of these Jewish believers were actually being tempted to revert to Judaism in order to escape Roman persecution. And the main thrust of the book is an appeal by the writer to these Jewish believers not to go back to their old beliefs and their old traditions, because what they'd enter into was so much better in every way. And he trades on their knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures to demonstrate to them how much more superior the new covenant is over the old covenant. And specifically, he devotes a lot of the book to explaining how much more the atoning blood of Jesus' sacrifice is able to save them from their sins, which of course the blood of bulls and goats could never do. And the writer also brings some significant revelation regarding the high priesthood of Jesus and how he is the mediator of the new covenant and serves as a king priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And the whole book is really a celebration of the superiority and the glory of Jesus. And for us, of course, as Gentile believers, it's a treasure trove of revelation that helps us to connect the old covenant with the new, and to see the Jewish roots of our faith and how vital they are in our understanding of who we are as sons of God. And so we've come to chapter 11 of Hebrews, which is probably the chapter that most people know about in Hebrews, and most of us are aware that it's all about faith. And we've come to the point where we're about halfway through the chapter. I haven't got time to recap on what we've learnt in the chapter so far, but the reason this chapter is here is because in chapter 10, the writer's been speaking about being able to enter into the holy place with confidence through the blood of Jesus. And he introduces this whole chapter on faith by saying that this confidence that we can have to enter into the holy place comes by faith, and it carries a great reward. But it requires 2 things. It requires endurance and perseverance in order to receive what's promised. So at the end of chapter 10, we see this. He says, "But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve our souls." So that's how the writer to Hebrews actually introduces this whole chapter. And he's saying that faith is actually what gives us the ability to endure, so that we don't give up, we don't lose our reward. And that's why he devotes the whole of this chapter to giving us some examples of faith demonstrated in the lives of many Old Testament saints, drawing out lots of different aspects of faith that leads to endurance. And in fact, at the very beginning of the chapter, in verse 1, the writer tells us that faith actually gives us an assurance that our biblical hope will be realized, and puts a substance onto things that we can't necessarily see with our own physical eyes. But this isn't a blind faith, but it's faith that's based on reality, the reality of what we read in the scriptures. And then down a few verses in verse 6, he tells us that without faith, we cannot please God. So if we need faith to please God, then where do we get this faith from? Now, if I were to ask you this morning, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your faith level? I wonder what you would say. I guess most of us, if we're honest, would come up with a figure somewhere below 10, wouldn't we? Right? But you see, what this chapter is telling us is that faith is not something that we have to somehow manufacture or conjure up out of nothing. We can't just create faith any more than we can create love or hope. And the Bible tells us that our faith is deeply connected to something else. And that something else is God's faithfulness. So our faith is not a product of our own ability to believe or anything like that, but it's actually a response to our acceptance of God's faithfulness. Now, this is clearly demonstrated in Psalm 91, where he says, the psalmist says this, "For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday." And it's that little bit there that I've underlined. God's faithfulness is a shield and buckler. So the reality is that when it comes to our own faith, because God is always faithful, he's never anything but faithful, and if our faith is dependent on God's faithfulness, then our own faith level should always be hovering around about the 10 mark. All right? Now that sounds very simple, doesn't it? But we all know that the reality is often tempered by our own fickleness and the circumstances in which we're called to exercise this faith. But the basis of our faith never changes. It's God's faithfulness. And it's how we respond to that faithfulness that determines what level of faith we're operating in. And so that's why the writer to Hebrews uses so many different and diverse examples of people and circumstances and how they walked out their faith in order to encourage us in our own walk of faith in the generation in which we live. So today we're going to look at 3 people who exercised faith at a very strategically important time of their lives. It was in their last days, just before they died. And so here it is. Hebrews 11, verses 20 to 22. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Well, there's a very cheerful subject for us this morning. 3 dying men and some of their last words that we're going to be looking at this morning. And I guess in some ways it's no coincidence that we should come to these verses when in our nation the subject of death is very much on the agenda. You know, there was a report out this week that showed the UK to have the highest death rate of all nations because of COVID. Now, I'm not going to address that this morning, but, you know, how we leave this world is something that the Bible actually does speak about. And therefore, we should give it some consideration. And I think that these 3 guys, these 3 examples, are going to be helpful to us, especially as for most of us who are listening in this morning, you know, we're probably nearer the end of our lives here on earth than the beginning. And so maybe our focus is a little different. But let me give you a quote from the Bible commentary writer Matthew Henry to set the scene for us this morning. Okay? Though the grace of faith is of universal use throughout the Christian's life, yet it is especially so when we come to die. Faith has its great work to do at the very last, to help believers to finish well, to die to the Lord so as to honour him by patience, hope and joy, so as to leave a witness behind them of the truth of God's word and the excellency of his ways. So here, in this great chapter on faith, the writer presents us with 3 great examples of men who face death with full faith. Now, it has to be said that they hadn't always lived lives full of faith. In fact, frequently, if we study their stories in the book of Genesis, we're going to find that they've been quite unfaithful. But in each case, when the time came for them to make their exit, they each exhibited great faith. And I think that one of the lessons that we can learn from these guys is that it was faith that enabled them to have a triumphant passage through death, and that they were able to view it as something positive and not something to be feared. Now, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to the people that the writer was originally addressing when we read all these verses, because they would have known all the backstory. You see, they would have known the scriptures that outline the stories of these 3 men. So we're going to have to fill in a few details as we go in order to make sense of what the writer is telling us. And in each case, the main point that the writer is making is actually contained in verse 13 of Hebrews 11. He says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth." So that's really the context for pretty much the whole of Hebrews chapter 11. They all died never having seen the fulfillment of what God had promised. But as we're going to see, they each passed on the promise to their children by faith. The promise was first given to Abraham, and God promised Abraham 3 things. He said, firstly, I'm going to give you a land for your possession. And then secondly, I'm going to raise up a seed through you that will become a great nation. And then thirdly, through your seed, all the world will be blessed. Wow, wonderful promises. Now, Abraham lived a very full and a very long life, but he never saw any of these things come to pass. So he died in faith, saying, Isaac, I'm passing these promises on to you. You're going to see the beginning of these things. But then Isaac never saw the fulfillment of these promises either. But he died in faith, saying, Jacob, I'm passing these promises on to you. You're going to see the beginning of these things. And Jacob had many wonderful encounters with the Lord, but he too didn't see the fulfillment of these promises. So he died in faith, saying, Joseph, I'm passing these promises on to you. You're going to see the beginning of these things. Now, Joseph actually did begin to see the very beginning of some of these things. But he died in faith, saying, Ephraim and Manasseh, I'm passing these promises on to you. You're going to see the beginning of these things. And they did. Ephraim and Manasseh were the first to begin to see the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. Now, what we need to see here is that they were not despairing or disillusioned in any way because they, in their own lifetimes, didn't see what God had promised. Their faith kept the promises alive, and they faithfully passed on the promises to their children. Why? Because God always kept his word, and they believed it, even though they never saw it with their own eyes. Abraham entered the land of promise, but he never possessed it. He lived in it as a stranger and as a sojourner. But he believed that the promise would be fulfilled. His son Isaac was a nomad for most of his life, well, in fact for all of his life, wandering from place to place, but he believed the promise would be fulfilled. Jacob ended up as an exile in the land of Egypt, but he believed the promise would be fulfilled. Joseph attained much greatness, but it was that of a stranger in a foreign land, but he believed that the promise would be fulfilled. They all knew that God would one day fulfill the promise because they knew that God was a covenant-keeping God. Not one of them ever doubted that the promise would come to pass. And so they all died in faith, defeating death because they knew that although they would die, the promise of God could never die. And that's the kind of faith that God wants to impart in to implant in each one of our hearts. You know, it's a faith that endures and doesn't give up, even when circumstances might say otherwise. It's a faith that recognizes that God's word and his promises are bigger than us. You know, they're not limited to our lifetimes for their fulfillment. And that's why the writer chooses these three as his next examples, because they're great illustrations of this kind of faith. So let's just remind ourselves what the writer says about, first of all, Isaac. He said, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Well, actually the writer here says very little about Isaac, because he knows that his readers would be very familiar with Isaac's story. So let's just fill in a little bit of context concerning Isaac. We haven't got time to read the whole story this morning. Actually, you know, Isaac lived longer than any of the four patriarchs. And yet, although he lived the longest, the least is written about him. All of the others have about 12 chapters devoted to their story. But Isaac's story is condensed to just about 2 chapters, Genesis 26 and 27. And if you look at Isaac's story, Isaac is probably the least spectacular of the patriarchs, living a relatively ordinary, uneventful life. He comes across really as someone who is rather passive and is an unspectacular character, eclipsed by a spectacular father and a spectacular son. And he lived a relatively quiet life. Spiritually, he was actually quite weak for the most part. It would actually be very easy to be quite negative about Isaac. And it's not the purpose of the writer to focus on his failings, but to commend him for his faith at the end of his life. Now, probably one of the best ways to sum up Isaac was that he was in some ways a very typical second-generation believer. He lived in the shadow of his father. His wife was chosen for him. And certainly in his latter years, he became a little bit of a foodie. He spent a lot of his time going from place to place digging wells. Actually, it's these wells that mark a somewhat amusing season of Isaac's life. You see, God had told Isaac that he wanted to take him to the promised land. Not to own it, but to dwell in it, to live in it. And he said, don't settle down anywhere else. Go to the promised land. But Isaac wasn't really connecting the dots. And he ended up in a land called Gerar, which was occupied by the Canaanites. And they were a pagan people. And instead of just sojourning there or just staying for a little while as God had commanded, he settled down and he dwelt there. And he had lots of herds and flocks of sheep and cattle. And so when he stopped, he dug a well in order to water them. It's what you would do, you know. But of course, this isn't what God wanted. So God had a plan. He sent along some Philistines and they blocked up the well. And so Isaac, not being the kind of guy to, make an issue of it and confront them and, make any kind of trouble, he just up sticks and moved to another place. And he settled down. And he dug another well. So along came the Philistines and they blocked up that well. And so Isaac moved on again. But every time he dug a well, along came the Philistines and they blocked it up. Then after several cycles of digging wells and having them blocked up, Isaac finally got the message and moved to Beersheba. He was finally in the land of promise, just where God wanted him. That same night when he arrived in Beersheba, God appeared to Isaac and confirmed the promises that he'd made to Abraham. And guess what Isaac's response was after his encounter with God that night? Yep, you guessed it, he dug another well. And that one wasn't blocked up by the Philistines. So Isaac's life on the whole was rather weak and insipid. And yet, through it all, he still believed God. And it was at the end of his life that he achieved the greatness that the writer of Hebrews singles him out for. But even then, he finally wound up doing the right thing only because everyone else set it up, so he couldn't help but do the right thing, even though he himself thought he was doing something else. You see, after Isaac married Rebekah, they discovered that actually Rebekah was barren. She couldn't conceive. And so Isaac prayed to God, and God blessed them, not just with one child, but with twins. But before they were born, prophetically, God said to Rebekah that there were two nations in her womb, one of which would be stronger than the other, and the elder would serve the younger. Now, this was a reversal of the expected normal sequence of events, because the oldest son always used to become the leader of the family, and the second son always served the first son. Well, we know the story, don't we, that Esau was born first and Jacob was born second. Remember when Jacob came out, he was clutching hold of Esau's heel. Esau became a skilled hunter, and he was always Isaac's favourite son, whereas Jacob was a bit more placid, a bit more of a mother's boy, and he was clearly the favourite of Rebekah. So when the time came when Isaac was advanced in years and his eyesight was not so good, probably had cataracts or something like that, and he thought that the time of his death was approaching, so he arranged a time when he would confer the family blessing on the elder son, which of course would have been Esau. Now, on hearing this, Rebekah went into action with a plan to secure the blessing on her favourite, on Jacob. Did she think she was rescuing God's prophetic word? Or was she just wanting her favourite son to obtain the blessing? We don't know. But at the same time, you see, Isaac was probably not intending to deliberately go against God's revealed word. But being the kind of character he was, he probably didn't understand the significance of that word. And he was just following the normal custom by blessing his eldest son, who just happened also to be his favourite son. And it seems he hadn't actually exerted much effort into inquiring of God as to the meaning of the prophecy or how to apply it. In reality, when you read the story, it seems he was more interested in tasting his favourite meal than in following God's ways. And I'm sure we all know the story of how Jacob dressed up in Esau's clothes and took the stew to his aged father and deceived him into giving him the blessing. And being thus deceived, Isaac inadvertently fulfilled God's prophetic word to Rebekah by conferring that blessing upon Jacob. Now you're probably thinking by now, how in this seeming comedy of errors does this demonstrate faith on the part of Isaac? Why does the writer to Hebrews commend Isaac for his faith when he's clearly been deceived and his intention was to do the opposite of what God wanted? The answer lies in his response when the truth of the matter was revealed. He had blessed the wrong person, but actually he'd really blessed the right person. You see, Isaac realized what has happened, and he doesn't attempt to revoke the blessing. He says, and he shall be blessed. In fact, he confirms the blessing. The blessing stands. Jacob is indeed the recipient of the blessing. And I think that is Isaac's genuine faith. It was something that he didn't want, and he was willing to try and change it. But when God caused him to bless the one he didn't mean to bless, he said, and he shall be blessed. He acknowledged that he'd done something wrong, and God had overruled him. He bows to the providence of God. And that shows Isaac's genuine faith. That was what the writer to Hebrews saw, and that's why he commends him as a man of faith. Now, of course, we know that he also went on to bless Esau with a different blessing, but it was still a great blessing. Esau, again, he also became a great nation. It just wasn't the blessing that God had for Jacob. And you read on, in Genesis, how the difference between the reaction of Jacob and the reaction of Esau actually caused conflict between them. Well, let's go on, and we spent quite a bit of time on Isaac. We're going to look much more briefly at the other two, at Jacob and Joseph. So let's have a look at Jacob and remind ourselves what the writer to Hebrews said about him. He says in verse 21, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. I don't know if you know this story as well as the one we've just looked at. It's probably true to say that of all the patriarchs, Jacob is probably the most colourful in terms of his character. His name, Jacob, pretty much defines his character in his early life. It means twister or deceiver. And it wasn't until he'd had his encounter with the Lord at Peniel that he began to change. And it was there that the Lord gave him the new name of Israel, which of course ultimately became the name of the whole nation. So there's a lot we could say about Jacob. He walked by faith sometimes, he walked by sight at other times. He was holy sometimes, he was sinful at other times. But the writer to Hebrews doesn't dwell on the events of his life. He homes in and he focuses on the end of Jacob's life at the ripe old age of 147. So, in Hebrews, we encounter Jacob when he's about to die, and he's still not seeing the fulfillment of the promises made to his grandfather Abraham and confirmed to him. And the account of what happened is found in Genesis 48. By now, Jacob, remember, was living in Egypt. He'd gone down there to join Joseph to escape the famine in Canaan. And the word came to Joseph that his father Jacob was sick and was near to death. So Joseph went to Jacob and took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who Manasseh was the older and Ephraim was the younger. By now, Jacob was quite frail, and so he was leaning on his staff as he spoke to Joseph. And he tells Joseph that he regards Joseph's offspring just like he regards his own offspring, his own sons, even though they'd been born in Egypt in the days before Jacob and Joseph had been reunited and reconciled. Now Jacob says to Joseph that he wants to impart his blessing on Manasseh and Ephraim. So Joseph brings his boys forward. It's important that we understand the logistics of what happens here. You see, when imparting a blessing, it was normal to do so by laying the right hand on the one being blessed. And as we know, the expectation would have been that the eldest son would be the one that would receive the blessing. So Joseph brings his two sons forward, so that Manasseh, the eldest, was standing by Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim was standing by his left hand. And all Jacob had to do was to stretch out his hands and place them on the boys' heads. But you know what he did? Instead of reaching his hands forward, he crossed them, so that his right hand was on Ephraim's head and his left hand was on Manasseh's head. And as Jacob began to speak his blessing over the boys, Joseph noticed that Jacob's hands had been crossed over. So he tried to stop Jacob, explaining that he got his hands mixed up. But Jacob refused to change, and he said to Joseph, "I know, my son. Manasseh also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." I think, the point that the writer of Hebrews is making here is that even though Jacob is now at the very end of his life, he's weak in his body, so much so that he has to lean on his staff. And yet, his faith is stronger than ever. He has seen God's faithfulness in so many ways in his life, not least in bringing him to Egypt to escape the famine. And in the process of being reunited with his son Joseph, now his faith is compelling him to pass on God's blessing to his son and to his grandsons. And contained within that blessing, he's passing on those promises of God. Here's the words of blessing that Jacob used that confirms his confidence and his faith that God will fulfill all of his promises. I find it in Genesis 48, verses 15 and 16. The God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now, in the closing few moments, let's just turn our attention to the end of Joseph's life. Okay, let's again just remind ourselves what the writer says about Joseph. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, Joseph demonstrates many instances of strong faith in God throughout his lifetime. He'd resisted the seductive attempts of Potiphar's wife. He'd remained true to God while being imprisoned unjustly. His faith enabled him to interpret dreams on several occasions, and he dealt in a godly manner with his brothers who had wronged him. And he'd administered the food relief program in Egypt fairly, without greed. But the writer of Hebrews skips over all of these examples of faith, and he picks out the one about Joseph's bones. Now, Joseph, as we know, was in Egypt, and we now see him at the end of his days. It's actually now been 200 years since Abraham first received the promises of God. 200 years. And there was no sign of fulfillment. And Joseph was in Egypt, far from the land of promise. But as his days grew nearer to the end, Joseph gathered his brothers and his sons together and said these words to them. He said, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Now, that was quite a prophetic word, if you look at it. He says, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you out of this land. Now, of course, at the time when Joseph was speaking this, they weren't in slavery. They weren't in oppression. They were actually being blessed as, the sons of Jacob in the land. They were really just no more than an extended family. And it's as they grew into a nation over the next 400 years that they began to be oppressed by Egypt. And Joseph sees this, and he says that God will visit you, and he will bring you out of the land. It's not, that you're just going to go, but he will bring you out of the land. And he says, and when you go, when he takes you out of the land, I want you to take my bones with you, so that I don't stay here in Egypt when you go. I want to go with you into the promised land. So here the faith of Joseph that the writer of Hebrews is commending is laid out before us. He's confident that God is in control, that he hasn't forgotten his promises. He tells them to expect God to intervene and to bring them up out of the land where they've been sojourning. where they've been for so long, and he's going to bring them into the promised land. In fact, he's so confident that it's going to happen that he says it twice. God will surely visit you, he says. And he adds, when he does, I don't want my bones to remain here in Egypt. I want you to take my bones with you when you enter the promised land and bury them there, because that land is my inheritance. It's the land of God's promise. And just as a corollary to this act of faith, God granted his dying wish. And as we read in Exodus 13:19, when they left Egypt, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. And I think, that was God's way of honouring Joseph for his faith. Well, we must draw this to a close. And as we've looked at these three very different men and how their faith at the end of their lives not only let them die victoriously, but it acted as a seed to be passed on to the next generation. And I think that's the main point that the writer of Hebrews is making here. Their faith is not directed towards the past. Their faith is directed towards the fulfillment of the promises. And I think that's the point for us, that God has made promises for us that we may not see fulfilled in our lifetime, but it's our responsibility to pass on the promises of God to the next generation. And in one sense, you see, all of these guys, their faith was eschatological. It pointed forward to the future. For them, the promises were about a land and a nation and a worldwide blessing. And where I want to leave us this morning is in a similar place, really, because we too have promises that we look forward to. These promises include the very same promises that Isaac, Jacob and Joseph lived and died for. They were ultimately looking for a city whose architect and builder was God. Now we know that city as the New Jerusalem. And that's one of the promises that we know that we will one day inherit. Whether that's in our lifetime or whether that's beyond our time on the earth, it doesn't really matter. We know that it's going to happen. And we're going to be just as alive when we get there as we are now. And so all of the promises that we look forward to, they're eschatological. And they're all Israel-centric. And they're all Jesus-centric. In other words, these promises are going to find their fulfillment in the redemption of Israel and the bringing in of the kingdom and the government of God on the earth as it is in heaven. All of these promises and many others, they all find their fulfillment in the person and the coming of Jesus. Our hope is in his return to complete the work that he began with his first coming. He will come and he will have complete victory over his enemies. He will finally crush Satan's head and he will establish his kingdom of righteousness here on the earth. Will we see the fulfillment of these promises in our lifetime? I don't know. But we do know that as each day passes, we're one day nearer to the return of the King. God has set a day, the great and awesome day of the Lord, and it will surely come. And one way or the other, we who endure to the end will be there, either caught up to be with him in the sky or coming with him in the clouds of glory, if our days on earth have ended before he returns. We've got a glorious hope. We have glorious promises to hold on to. And so that's my encouragement to you this morning. Hold fast to what you have so that no one can steal that which is laid up for you in heaven. That's what Jesus exhorted the church in Philadelphia to do. And this is what the writer of Hebrews is exhorting us to do, following the example of these three men who remained faithful to the end. He says, I am coming soon. hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown.